recounting that every COVID package we passed last year, we did on a bipartisan basis. There was almost no opposition to most of those bills. And I was hoping the new administration, particularly given the president discussing so frequently being a moderate, would choose to take a different path, particularly when you look at the numbers. A 50-50 Senate, a narrow majority in the House. I would think, looking at that, your conclusion would be maybe we ought to start on a bipartisan basis. But alas, that is not the case. As you know, 10 of our members actually went down, met with the president, and talked about a more narrow, targeted approach. The message was that they were not interested in doing it that way. They're going to try to muscle us through on a totally partisan basis. And I think I can safely speak for most of my members that we think this is dramatically more money than is required at this particular juncture. It also includes a number of things that have absolutely nothing to do with COVID relief. And so it will be controversial. And we expect, obviously, we'll get this package over from the House, and we'll deal with it accordingly through the reconciliation process here in the Senate.
Well, it was a very grim reminder when we passed the 500,000 death number when it comes to coronavirus. It's very sobering, and obviously a reminder that even though we've made a lot of headway in battling this, we still have a lot of work to do, which is why I wish the Senate Democrats would work in a serious way with us in trying to come up with solutions that will actually help us continue to battle the disease. Instead, they seem bent on a path, as the leader pointed out, that consists largely of trying to fulfill a liberal wish list. If you look at many of the components of their bill, for example, the amount that they spent on public health only constitutes about 10% of the entire $1.9 trillion. 95% of the money that they put toward education wouldn't be spent until after 2021, in other words, 2022 through 2028. Hardly seems like an emergency if you're not be able to get the money out there quickly. And you know, obviously there have been Republicans who've expressed an interest in trying to work with the Democrats. So far they have rejected those efforts. It seems to me, as the leader pointed out, that this has been an attempt by the Democrats to do this at 51 votes. After we did 5 coronavirus bills last year under regular order at the 60-vote threshold in the Senate in a bipartisan way. They have decided first bill out of the gate this year, coronavirus bill, which is, again, is way too big to start with and has a lot of questionable pieces to it. They decided to try and do it at 51 votes, I think, which tells you that this is never about trying to get a bipartisan bill that deals with the virus, but rather using the pandemic for political gain. They seem a lot more interested in making sure that there are taxpayer dollars allocated to Planned Parenthood than they are about getting kids back into the classroom. It's $1.9 trillion that we don't have. It's borrowed money, and it's going to be spent in a lot of ways that, frankly, have nothing to do with the emergency at hand. And I hope that, as the leader pointed out, Republicans will all stand against it.
We're now 1 month into the administration, and what we're seeing is truly a radical leftist agenda by this administration, attacked on American energy, which is going to cost this country 1 million jobs. The threat of a national mandate on the minimum wage, doubling it. The Congressional Budget Office says we'd lose perhaps another 1.5 million jobs. 2.5 million Americans cannot afford to lose their jobs now or ever in this country. And you know, what the Democrats have put together really is a liberal wish list of liberal priorities, bailing out California, Illinois, and New York. We have a 50-50 Senate. We ought to be working in a bipartisan way. We've passed 5 bipartisan bills. Republicans want to work with Democrats to get people vaccinated, to make sure that we can get people back to work, keeping small businesses viable, people on the payrolls. We want to make sure that the schools get open and stay open. This past week in Wyoming, I traveled to a number of schools, had one time in a high school gymnasium with 350 students, and I talked to the principal and said, how have you done it? What's the answer? He said, well, it's a great effort by teachers working with students and parents. He said, but the real unsung heroes, he said, were the custodians, the people who kept the schools closed. Schools all across America ought to be open right now. And yet Joe Biden has surrendered to the teachers union. They sent him a ransom note and he was happy to pay it. Tens of billions of dollars in this past coronavirus relief bill haven't been spent yet. I have no idea what the moving target is going to be at today in terms of getting kids back to school. Recently they said, well, maybe a couple of months from now we'll have half of the schools open, and they counted one day a week as being an open school day. That's not the case. Look, this administration has fallen in line behind the teachers union, and yet every day our own students continue to fall behind in their quest for an education. With a 50-50 Senate, we ought to be working in a bipartisan way to get people back to work, kids back to school, and get the coronavirus behind us.
We had a helpful first hearing today with the Rules Committee and the Homeland Security Committee on what happened at the Capitol on January the 6th. I think the biggest takeaway from today, for me at least, was that the structure, the police board structure, which I've questioned for some time now, but that structure of the two sergeant-at-arms, the architect of the Capitol, the chief of police as an ex officio non-voting member is almost totally unworkable in times of crisis. It's adequate on the day-to-day things that happen at the Capitol, but at a crisis moment like we had on January the 6th, the sergeant-at-arms for the House is interested, as he should be, in protecting House members. The Sergeant-at-Arms for the Senate is interested in securing and protecting senators. Nobody is particularly focused on what it takes to protect everybody else that works here, people who are visiting here. I think we're going to have to look at that. We had, among other things today, sort of a missing hour where the police chief said he talked to the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House at 1:09, and the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House doesn't remember that conversation and thinks it may have been anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour later. Well, an hour on January the 6th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon made a big difference. And so it's a start. We'll look at the Defense Department and why the National Guard took so long to get here in the next hearings we have. But I think today we saw a lot of problems with the structure itself at a crisis moment where the structure actually got in the way of getting things done that needed to be done and needed to be done quickly.
$275,000 women left the workforce in January. And this is something that we can't continue to sustain. Why are women leaving the workforce during COVID-19? It is because their children, most of the time, in many of those cases, are not in school. There is not childcare available to support them. Those that are working with their children feel that they have to leave the workforce. And so they're stepping aside and they're putting their own goals to the rear and putting their children first to make sure that they are educating their children. That means years of income as they look to the future, they will be set behind their male peers. So we have to re-engage women. So how do we correct this? How do we get women back in the workforce during a pandemic? Well, we continue to open up the economy, but we put our kids first and we get them back to school. We can safely reopen our schools. Now, our children are suffering. Virtual learning is not the same as in-person learning. So not only are they falling behind academically, but their mental health is suffering. So we have to open those schools. What we have to do, though, is push on those public sector unions. They are putting their own interests first rather than focusing on the harm that this is doing to our children. Their political policies, their stances are not benefiting our children, and they are certainly not benefiting the women that have had to put their own futures aside. So kudos to Governor Kim Reynolds of Iowa. Because of her and safely reopening our schools, our Iowa students have been back in school since last August. So I wish more states would follow our governor's example, safely reopen those schools and make sure that we are considering our children and their future. So for heaven's sakes, folks, let's start reopening the economy and let's reopen our schools.
In 4 weeks, the Biden administration has been known for two things: open borders and closed schools. First, they said that they had to follow the science to open up the schools. Well, the CDC has said we could open these schools safely. Then they said they need money. Well, last year, Congress allocated $68 billion for K-12 education, and approximately $4 billion of it has been spent. So it clearly is not waiting for money. It's just basically Democrats and the teachers union don't care about our students. In the new bill, they want to spend over $120 billion, and 95% of it will not be spent this year to open schools. It'll be spent in the future to open schools, 22 to 28. So this new stimulus package is not going to do anything to open our schools. They need to decide to open our schools. And also on top of that, there's no money to secure our border. So Democrats don't care about our family safety, and they clearly don't care about our kids' education.
Yeah,
in light of the attack leveled against you by the former president, do you regret your comments at all, accusing him of a disgraceful dereliction of duty and being morally and practically responsible for the attack?
I really don't have anything to add on that subject.
Leader McConnell, given the current state of the GOP with its deep divisions, in hindsight, do you regret not doing more earlier on as leader to distance the party from the more radical white supremacist elements that have found a home in the conservative movement? Should you have done more as leader?
Yeah, well, I think what you need to focus on is how unified we are today in opposition to what the Biden administration is trying to do. I've known Joe Biden for a long time. He's got an A-plus personality. Everybody likes him. Best evidence of that, he did a eulogy at Strom Thurmond's funeral and a eulogy at Jesse Helms' funeral. Everybody likes Joe Biden. What I didn't remember was that he was a moderate. And so what we have seen here at the beginning of this administration is pretty far left across the board. And the best evidence of it that's currently before us is the way they've chosen to take a totally partisan approach to COVID relief. Totally different from the way it was addressed by the Republican majority Senate last year, the Democrat House last year, and the Republican president last year. So I'm interested in what we're doing now and looking forward.
There's some discussion about going back and bringing back earmarks, albeit with transparency and some limits. Are you open to that, or what's your position on that?
You have to ask Senator Shelby about that. I did notice the House was going back in that direction. I don't have any thoughts about it at the moment.
On the COVID relief bill, the polling on it all shows that somewhere between 60 and 70% of Americans do approve of what the Biden administration is putting forward. Do you worry at all that, as you said, your unity in opposing it puts Republicans on the opposite side of the American people on this bill?
Well, I'm sure everybody would love to get a check. But they haven't yet learned about what else is in it. And part of our job as the substantial minority, remember we're in a 50-50 Senate here, is to make sure the American people fully understand what's being proposed. Is it a good idea to stick all of these extraneous matters into it? We were open, at least 10 of us, went down to the White House, discussed with the president something more narrow and targeted to the conditions that we find today. Look at the size of this package. It's the size of the CARES Act. We passed that in March of 2020. This is not 2020. There are hopeful signs that the economy is coming back. Vaccines are being distributed. The statistics are going in a better direction. We're in favor of targeting this relief to the conditions that we find today and looking forward, not backward.
Yeah. When you think of the $3 trillion price tag that's being bandied about a second package to come after this, Bernie Sanders addressed it today and said, don't focus on the price tag.
Well, I think we can anticipate they're going to try to use reconciliation one more time, and that'll be to raise taxes. And I notice the administration's in favor of at least getting the corporate rate from 21 up to 28. My guess is that's not where it'll stop. And so we'll have a big, robust discussion about the appropriateness of a big tax increase in the wake of our current situation. And my guess is they'll get around to that pretty soon, and we'll be dealing with that as well. Thanks a lot.